Desert Immigrants by Mario T. Garcia. Chapter 9, Part 2. Sorry, there was an interruption on my phone. Border Revolution. When fighting subsided, both towns joined in celebrating Madero's great triumph. 10,000 Mexicans, including several hundred Mexican Americans, accompanied by brass band, crossed the border one evening and paid tribute to Maderistas. In turn, many of Madero's officers shopped and dined in El Paso. Colonel Francisco Villa made his appearance in the Sheldon Hotel lobby yesterday afternoon about 3 o'clock. The reporter commented, and after walking about for several minutes, entered the cafe where he ordered lunch. Yet Villa and other things on his mind than a meal, learning that the famous Mexican revolutionary had intentions of having a shootout with another insurrecto personality, Italian soldier of fortune Colonel Giuseppe Garibaldi. Mayor Henry Kelly persuaded Villa to peacefully return across the river. Fascinated by the appearances of colorful figures such as Villa, Garibaldi, and Orozco, El Pasoans reserved their largest accolade for the apostle of democracy. Madero, at a reception and banquet in Madero's honor, Kelly, as well as other city dignitaries, praised the men whom they expected would bring peace and prosperity to Mexico, a condition so vital for El Paso's own fortunes. El Paso had a warm spot in her heart for the insurrecto leader. The Times stressed and rejoices with him that newer and better things have dawned for the Republic of Mexico. Despite his victory over Diaz and his election as Mexico's president, Madero faced various rebellions against his authority in the north. The most significant challenge to the new administration consisted of the Red Flaggers, the followers of ex-Maderista Pascal Orozco, who now led a conservative counter-revolution in Chihuahua. There are more than 1,000 rebels now in El Paso. The local agent of the Mexican Northwestern Railroad notified his New York employers, most of whom would welcome an opportunity of slipping into Juarez, unquote. The Red Flaggers, importing guns through El Paso with the help of local junta, mounted a successful assault on Juarez and captured the town on February 27, 1912. However, the subsequent United States arms embargo on Mexico severely damaged Orozco's cause, and the revolt failed. During the struggle, Orozco's opponents had often published scathing attacks on his character and had distributed them along the border. One biased flyer distributed among El Paso Mexicans accused Orozco of being a traitor, of enjoying orgies while his men went to battle, and of hoarding thousands of dollars in El Paso banks. Although Orozco possessed a strong following in El Paso, especially among the wealthy Porfirista exiles, many local Mexicans welcomed the return of Madero's troops to the border. The Mexican people residing in El Paso, unquote, the pro-Madero Times reported, will manifest their immense satisfaction at the occupancy of Ciudad Juarez by the soldiers of the constitutional government of the Southern Republic by a parade of patriotic clubs, which will take place this afternoon, moving from the city over on one of the international bridges to welcome and congratulate the Army Command, led by Madero supporters organized in a group called the Defenders of Order. Most of El Paso Mexican clubs and societies, many of them containing Mexican American members, as well as immigrants, cooperated on the parade in order to demonstrate that the border city remained a Maderista stronghold. Unfortunately for Madero, the Orozco Rebellion only started more serious counter-revolution by Porfiristas in a little over a year after his election as president. Excuse me. Madero fell before the reactionary forces of General Victoriano Huerta during the 10 tragic days of February 1913. The American consul at Ciudad Juarez correctly judged the Huerta's intention was to restore the old Diaz's regime. Although without Diaz himself, the civil war that followed between the constitutionalists led by Carranza and Villa on one side, the Huerta supporters on the other, introduced the bloodiest phase of the revolution. Seeing the both seeing that both factions were using El Paso as a base of operations, American officials kept close surveillance on possible violations of the neutrality laws. Quote, there appears to be an unusual number of revolutionists in El Paso at this time. One federal agent informed the Department of Justice, yet rebels were not only secret agents arriving in the border city. Conditions are just just about as badly as they can be. Added a railroad man. El Paso is simply flooded with Secret Service agents and representatives of the United States. These investigators did not always respect the privacy and rights of Mexican residents. For example, in January 1914, U.S. Army troops conducted a search in the smelter community where they believed ammunition for the constitutionalists had been restored, raiding half a dozen houses and causing much disturbance among the Mexican population. The Americans failed to discover anything. 2 days later, however, authorities captured 2 Mexicans in an alley south of San Francisco Street as they attempted to transfer 12,000 rounds of .30-30 ammunition from the warehouse of hardware dealer Croker, Zork, and May to Villa's forces in Juarez. Next to gun running, illegal enlistments in El Paso for the Mexican armies posed the most serious problem. At one point, Justice Department officers arrested the Mexican inspector. Mexican inspector, where did I go? I'm so sorry. I hate it when I do that. Right, Mexican pop. The Americans failed to discover anything 2 days later. Oh, there it is. Mexican alleys. Okay. Department officers arrested the Mexican inspector of consulates, the Mexican consul, the vice consul, and one other official for enlisting soldiers to Huerta's cause. According to the American investigators, the Mexican consulate in El Paso had agreed to provide transportation to Eagle Pass for 8 Mexicans on one condition they joined Huerta's army in Piedras Negras across the border. When taken into custody, the Mexican recruits admitted that besides paying their travel costs, the consulate had coached them to say, if questioned, that they represented refugees on their way back to Mexico. Not intimidated, Huerta agents apparently continued to recruit in El Paso. As the Mexican Civil War increased in intensity by the middle of the decade, so too did racial tensions along the border, especially following the Tampico incident and the later invasion and occupation of Veracruz by U.S. Marines in April 1914. To prevent any disturbances in the Mexican district over the international crisis over the possibility of an attack by Villa's forces stationed in Juarez, military patrols composed of infantry and cavalry from Fort Bliss patrolled Chihuahua during the week of April 21st. At the Army post, Fort Bliss, the cavalrymen were ordered to sleep with boots and saddles at their side, unquote, reported the New York Times correspondent in El Paso. They can be up and away in case of an alarm in less than 5 minutes, unquote. Mayor Kelly, although insisting that he expected no trouble, offered the Army use of the city facilities in case officials declared martial law, emphasizing that the troops did not interfere with the citizens. The El Paso Times believed that their presence was purely precautionary in an effort to further reduce the likelihood of a retaliation on El Paso. The newspaper stated in an editorial that the American action in Veracruz had not aimed at Carranza's movement, but at the Huerta government, which had insulted the U.S. flag at Tampico. And it appealed to the constitutionalists. Remember that Americans were their friends. One day after Veracruz invasion, a relieved Mayor Kelly proclaimed that no disturbance had taken place in Chihuahua and that everything remained quiet. The resident Mexican population, the mayor disclosed, had displayed no inclination to demonstrate support for either Huerta or Carranza over the American intervention. Kelly also denied rumors that in case of a border conflict of the Mexican population would be forced to cross into Juarez. Of course, nothing is more groundless, and I might say more foolish than this. He insisted. The American citizens of Spanish Mexican birth have every right here that the Americans have, and we have every reason to believe that they will meet the obligations resting on good citizens of supporting the government and preserving peace and quiet. The mayor added that all residents of El Paso, whether Americans or Mexicans, citizens or aliens, would be treated equally and fairly as long as they obeyed the law and did not attempt to incite disturbances. In spite of Kelly's reassurances, the presence of American military forces in Chihuahua could not help but add to American suspicions that the local Mexican population represented a possible threat to the city. A writer for McClure's magazine, for example, reported rumors circulating in El Paso that Mexican domestics intended to poison their employers. The arrest of Pro Huerta, publisher in El Paso, and the seizure of his press by police did not help relieve racial tensions either. According to the officials, Efraino M. Franco, editor of El Libre, had printed an appeal to the city's Mexican population to rise up against the gringos and join Huerta in defending their homeland. Hoping to avert such an occurrence, as well as to protect themselves against a growing anti-Mexican sentiment in El Paso, influential Mexican Americans, led by politicos, organized the mediating force between the American establishment and the Mexican immigrants and refugees. I have spent the entire day, Ike Alderut told a reporter, the day after the Veracruz invasion, quote, circulating among the Mexican refugees in El Paso and urging them to remember that they are in a foreign country here for protection, which they have and are still enjoying, unquote. Alderut cautioned the Mexicans not to do or say anything that might irritate or offend Americans. The refugees, the Mexican-American politician stated, understood the delicate situation and as far as he knew, did not intend to cause any trouble. Besides Alderut, it was reported that more than 600 other Mexican Americans, led by J.A. Escajita, offered to patrol Chihuahua as a peace force if so needed by Mayor Kelly, the Mexican Americans pledged their loyalty to the United States and resolved to fight on its side in case of war with Mexico. Escogido revealed that several months prior to the Veracruz incident, he had personally formed, trained, and drilled a company of Mexican Americans for patrol duty in the Mexican district or to join with American forces in the eventuality of an attack on Mexico. While we are called Mexicans, the district clerk patri- patriotically explained, explained, we are not. We are Americans, born and brought up under the stars and stripes and as loyal to it as any other American. Many people in this city have said that we would rise up and incite riots in this city. If President Wilson was forced to land American troops or Blue Jackets on Mexican soil, but quite on the contrary, we are ready to shoulder a rifle and march in the ranks with the American soldier who is of Anglo-Saxon or Celtic origin. Although the presence of American soldiers in Chihuahua helped calm fears of a possible rebellion within El Paso, rumors abounded of Villa's plans to invade the border city. As a result, El Paso gun shops faced a run on their supplies despite warnings by officials against the illegal carrying of weapons. For their own protection, many American wives and their children left the city by train. Those unable to flee or unwilling to abandon their homes moved farther north and east of the areas adjacent to the borders. Fearing as many as 15,000 Mexican soldiers, U.S. military authorities at Fort Bliss quickly dispatched a squadron of the 12th Cavalry, a battalion of the 20th Infantry, and a battery of the 6th Field Artillery to El Paso, besides guarding the reservoirs of the municipal water system, the electric light plants, and the gas works against sabotage. The troops stationed artillery where it could effectively shell Juarez and place machine guns in position commanding the international bridges. Expanding the American armed presence on the border, additional contingents arrived from San Antonio, San Francisco, and Columbus, New Mexico. Hence, by late April, El Paso hosted close to 6,500 troops under the command of General John Blackjack Pershing, with encampment at Washington Park and on Cotton Avenue. In addition, American ranchers, sheepmen, and miners in the vicinity organized a, quote, Rough Rider regiment and, according to one correspondent, clamored for action in Mexico. A tense and increasingly militarized city finally relaxed when Villa announced that he had no desire to invade El Paso and instead expressed friendship for the American people. Quote, Mexico has troubles enough of her own, Villa told the American press, and is not seeking a war with any foreign country, certainly not the United States. After Villa's anticipated attack failed to materialize, more normal conditions returned to El Paso. In the meantime, the constitutional forces disposed Huerta, but new storm clouds loomed as factionalism emerged within the victorious alliance. Desiring continued peace and reflecting on the critical years of the revolution between 1910 and 1915, the Herald congratulated El Pasoans for maintaining order regardless of the many provocations by both the United States government and the different Mexican revolutionary juntas that had used in El Paso as headquarters. It is a record of which El Paso has a right to be proud, unquote, the Herald boasted. Nothing can happen to change the temper of the El Paso people. They are not hostile toward Mexico are Mexicans and have never been hostile, unquote. El Pasoans had respected human rights during the period. The newspaper proudly stated, and peace and order had prevailed, astutely understanding that El Paso's dependence on Mexican commerce required tranquility and that the city's reliance on Mexican labor necessitated harmonious race relations. The Herald reassured Mexican immigrant workers. I'm so sorry. Mexican immigrant workers and political refugees of the border's hospitality as long as they refrained from political intrigue. To El Paso's Mexicans, it concluded, let it be said with the convictions of sincerity and with the consciousness of power that to them will be extended to the same protection that is accorded to our own people, always assuming, of course, that on their part they abide by the laws and do nothing calculated to create doubt, suspicion, or hostility, so long as they remain disposed to cooperate with us, to maintain order under a law, and to conserve peace and safety. They will be regarded as one with us, and they need not feel the least apprehensive of any unfortunate thing happening to disturb the friendly relations always existing. They are our guests. That is enough. But peace continued to elude Mexico, and the civil war between Villa and Carranza ignited a new round of racial tensions along the frontier. Recognized by the United States in the fall of 1915, Carranza's government soon reduced Villa to guerrilla tactics in Chihuahua. Isolated and short of munitions, Villa vented his frustrations against Americans, stopping a train from Chihuahua City. Villa's men on January 10, 1916, killed 16 American employees of Asarco in what came to be called the Santa Isabel Massacre. News of the incident and the arrival of the bodies in El Paso caused much excitement and unrest in the city, where many of the dead Americans had been known. Literature distributed to condemn the affair read, "Remember the Alamo, did we watch and wait?" Some Americans blamed the U.S. consul in Juarez, T.T. Edwards, for the killings and charged the American diplomat with not providing sufficient protection for the Americans in Chihuahua. At a local hotel 3 days after the tragic event, a crowd of Americans surrounded Edwards and accused him of being Villa's consul. "Go back to Juarez with the Mexicans," they shouted as the consul narrowly escaped their grasp. Demanding Edwards' removal from his post, 100 El Paso citizens sent a petition to Washington. "We will either have him removed," angrily declared one man, "or we'll lynch him." Although Edward and President Wilson's policy of watchful waiting received their share of condemnation for the Chihuahua murders, Mexicans on both sides of the border bore the brunt of American wrath over the Santa Isabel massacre. After soldiers had attacked 2 Mexicans at Broadway and San Antonio in the downtown section on the evening of January 13th, fights broke out between Americans and Mexicans in a number of saloons. Following the first fisticuffs. Between 25 and 50 Americans attacked every Mexican they could find on the streets. They moved in the direction of Chihuahua and called out to others to join them. "Let's get down and clean them out," the Americans yelled. Bleeding Mexicans lined the route, unquote. A reporter on the scene observed an estimated that close to 25 Mexicans had been injured by a crowd that had rapidly expanded. It was reported by 10 o'clock that knives frequently were used, unquote. The New York Times correspondent noted, and all ambulances in El Paso were rushing through the streets, while physicians were hurried to all parts of the city, declaring martial law. El Paso police formed a barricade along Broadway between Overland and 2nd Streets, blockading the major Mexican barrio, and pushed the mass of Americans calculated at between 800 and 1,000 back into central part of the city. A number of Pershing's troops, along with the National Guard, also arrived to reinforce local authorities. Mayor Tom Lee, together with the Mexican-American leaders, later that evening toured the Chihuahua and reported no disturbances among the Mexican residents who had secured themselves in their home. We've been patient and shown a fine wisdom for the past 5 years. Through all these distressing and harrowing experiences, the mayor commented on the crisis, quote, and I hope we shall not lose our heads at this late hour, unquote. Faced with the El Paso's most severe racial outburst, police arrested 15 Americans for disturbing the peace. Ironically, officials likewise apprehended 8 Mexicans on the same charge, as well as for carrying concealed weapons. Although they had been the victims of the riot, local leaders learned afterward, to their relief, that their swift control of the situation had possibly avoided a more serious conflict, as Carranza's forces in Juarez, upon hearing of the attack on Mexicans across the border, had threatened to intervene. No more racial problems occurred, but El Paso remained nervous. For the next several days, Consul Edwards in Juarez notified the State Department that although conditions in the Mexican border town remained quiet, they were feverish in El Paso, where demands for military intervention against Mexico had been made. In letters to the newspapers, El Pasoans shared some of their anxieties and thoughts. 4 Americans, including the son of one of the men killed at Santa Isabel, challenged their fellow citizens to live up to their honor and manhood by revenging the dead Americans. Can it be that the sons of the men who have made Americans veterans of many wars have no true blood? They wrote, let us cry out until we avenge the murdered Americans in Mexico, or completely erase all signs of the shame and outrages from the face of our beautiful flag. 2 other Americans charged Villa with barbarism and questioned Mexico's capacity to become civilized, expressing their displeasure at the ease with which Mexicans could obtain jobs in El Paso. They complained that many Americans walked around unemployed and unable to work because of the Mexican wages. One Mexican resident empathized and wrote that most Mexicans in the city deplored the Santa Isabel massacre. We feel ashamed that such acts are committed in our country, he noted. It is a disgrace to humanity that such assassins were born, unquote. Nevertheless, the Mexican believed that although blame could be bestowed on Villa, Carranza, and other Mexican leaders for the prevailing anarchy across the border, in his opinion, the biggest blame fell on President Wilson for pursuing an interventionist policy that had intensified bad feelings between Americans and Mexicans. In contrast to most other letter writers, one American woman called an El Pasoans to display Christian charity toward Villa and all Mexicans as a way of perhaps ending the conflict. By listening to the quiet voice within, she explained, I have found that we can live in heaven with Mexicans too. Villa is a divine soul struggling upward through darkness, through blindness, struggling upward to the light. The Herald, in reply, shunned the cry for revenge and expressed a more pragmatic, though no less political opinion, apparently held by most El Paso political and business leaders. Relieved that the city's racial violence had not led to serious fatalities or injuries, the Herald strongly deplored the outbreak. It pointed out that such incidents could only further endanger American lives in Chihuahua if Villa resorted to reprisals. The newspaper expressed shock that innocent Mexicans had been attacked solely because they were Mexicans. Quote, by such acts, it exhorted El Pasoans, we only place ourselves on the low plane of the desperate persons in Mexico who attack Americans because they are Americans, and whose morals we therefore despise, and whose punishment we all justly demand, unquote. The Herald concluded by reminding its readers once again of the Mexicans' population importance to El Paso and the need to respect their rights. There are tens of thousands of persons of Mexican descent in El Paso who are our neighbors, and many of whom have been our friends. They work for us and with us. They own property here, patronize the business constitutions, and take part in the life of the city. The lives, acts, thoughts, and intentions of most of these people are orderly. They are citizens or at least residents of El Paso and entitled to the same guarantees as any other citizens or residents. They are in no sense hostile to the United States or to Americans, and they deplore the terrors and crimes of Mexicans in Mexico as others do. Despite the Herald's plea for peace and harmony, just 2 months later, on March 9th, Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico, just west of El Paso, and precipitated Pershing's punitive expedition into Chihuahua's tension-gripped El Paso once again. Mario Acevedo remembers that his father warned him at the time not to leave the house because groups of Americans had begun to attack Mexicans on Santa Fe Street. One Mexican who possessed a dark complexion escaped serious injuries following the Columbus incident by claiming he was a black. I'm not a Mexican, unquote. He told pursuing Americans, I'm a nigger. The Herald, wishing to avoid any more racial friction, urged restraint on the part of the city's population while condemning Villa's action and approving the American intervention. Americans had no quarrel with Mexico or Carranza, the newspaper stressed, but only with Villa, and it assured Mexicans on both sides of the border of Wilson's non-belligerent policy, but defended Pershing's campaign as a police action. The Herald explained Washington's decision by saying that there would be no interferences with Mexican military or civil authorities, and no territory would be seized. The expedition's sole objective was to capture Villa and return him to the United States. General Pershing likewise issued a statement in El Paso intended to calm apprehensions, especially among the Mexican population. It is no time to indulge in idle theories about invasion, unquote. The American commander told reporters, I give the Mexican people too much credit for common sense to think they will not gladly accept our aid in eliminating an international outlaw. Although Villa's raid and Pershing's expedition remained the principal topic of conversation and of concern for El Pasoans, no major disturbances occurred. To ensure no repercussions and prevent a possible via raid on El Paso, the War Department rushed troop reinforcements to the border. El Paso is the most important crossing along the border. The New York Times emphasized it is not only a great railroad center, but too large a place to be left without an adequate garrison. In addition, police in a 2-day period rounded up, apparently without warrants, more than 200 Mexicans suspected of being via agents or sympathizers and deported half of them to Mexico. Quote, heavy guards are scattered throughout the city, unquote. One report read, especially in the Mexican Quarter. Those captured included 4 prominent Mexicans who had previously served on Villa's staff. The Texas Rangers in the area assisted local officials and apprehended 2 former Villa officers on charges of conspiring to commit arson. And on April 6th, El Paso detectives arrested 16 Mexicans on suspicion of being ex-supporters of Villa, but released them after interrogation. Besides suspected Villistas, any Mexican using language that could be interpreted by officers as inciting rebellion stood to be detained. For example, Elias Rivera, common laborer, faced arrest on a charge of using abusive language after police alleged that in speaking to a crowd in Chihuahua, Rivera had urged them to return to Mexico and fight against the American intervention. Local officials also stopped the presses of Mexican newspapers in El Paso that disagreed with Pershing's action in Mexico. The police explained that they had been informed that articles attacking the American policies had been printed in 3 Mexican dailies, and consequently they had been suspended. According to the New York Times reporter, the editor of the confiscated El Paso del Norte, a pro-Villa newspaper, had called on all Mexicans to defend themselves against the common enemy, unquote, and had predicted that all factions in Mexico would unite if Americans crossed the border. 3 additional Mexican dailies, likewise, had to close due to police censorship. All 6 resumed publication only after agreeing not to print, quote, political news that would, quote, tend to excite the Mexican people, unquote. Less than a week later, however, authorities arrested editor Emilio Valenzuela and 5 employees of the daily La Constitucion, besides confiscating their type and printing paper for writing articles designed to arouse anti-American feelings among the Mexicans of the city. Since copies of these newspapers could not be found, it remains impossible to prove or disprove the charges. Yet a week earlier, the New York Times had noted that the La Constitucion had been forced to stop its presses by local police when it had compared the American military action to the 1862 intervention in Mexico. Appearing to be overzealous, El Paso officials maintained law and order at the apparent expense of legal rights. Although federal agents on the scene repeatedly informed the State Department that no cause for alarm existed, although no significant racial violence erupted in the months following the Villa's bold raid, the prolongation of Pershing's expedition kept El Paso and the entire border region in an apprehensive state. Traveling from San Antonio to El Paso, Frank B. Elser, the special correspondent of the New York Times, wrote, "Everybody is talking Villa and a little close. The Columbus episode has quickened the pulse of the border and worked out a paradox. It has brought a new life to the frontier by bringing back the old. Remington died too soon. He said he should have seen his Southwest today. Men such as he so loved to draw, spurred and booted, and with a six-shooter on their hips, clumped along the station platforms or waved a hat from behind the barbed wire fence. It is men of this type who are piloting Pershing's expedition into Mexico. On the name that anti-American riots took place in Chihuahua City in mid-June, a small-scale riot occurred after a baseball game between an all-Mexican team and an American one in Washington Park. After American boys, encouraged by soldiers attending the game, had pelted the Mexican players with rocks. Several American men pounced on the Mexicans, including this 60-year-old father of one athlete. No serious injuries resulted, but one player suffered a face cut when hit by a bottle, and a Mexican boy at the scene had his head gashed by a flying rock. The police, claiming that only a minor scuffle had taken place, made no arrests. The incidents had no overt political importance. Yet the prevailing international crisis undoubtedly influenced such racial outbursts. Tensions further increased after the battle at Carrizal, Chihuahua, between Pershing's and the Carranza troops, in which a number of Americans died. Fearing a Mexican attack on El Paso, U.S. soldiers, besides patrolling the downtown area, placed artillery on Golden Hill, overlooking both El Paso and Juarez, and once again manned machine guns at the border crossings. Juarez citizens responded to the American maneuvers by arming themselves in preparation for a rumored invasion. In addition, El Paso police and Texas Rangers closely watched the Mexican population on the American side of the Rio Grande at a dance in Fabens in the lower El Paso Valley. Rangers arrested Maclavo Marhujo after he had yelled "Viva Mexico" and "Death to the Gringos." Another Mexican did not fare so well at the hands of the famed Texas law officer, charging him with recruiting for Villa. The Rangers shot and wounded an 18-year-old Mexican at Clint, also in the lower valley. In an effort to reduce the strife, the Herald claimed that El Paso remained secure. El Paso feels perfectly safe, unquote. The border publication emphasized she feels that her own people, including all those of foreign birth within her borders, are loyal to their city and friendly to each other, unquote. As a way of maintaining the security, 65,000 American troops bivouated. I've never heard of that word either. Bivouacked in El Paso by summer's end. Unable to capture Villa and faced with American involvement in the European War, Pershing abandoned Chihuahua in early 1917, thus considerably easing tensions in El Paso and throughout the border area. Whereas Villa's foray into the United States had once again raised the specter of racial conflict, El Paso's establishment had wisely recognized the damage such an outbreak would cause the border city, and hence successfully deterred violence, albeit with the strong military presence and the possible violation of legal rights. The Herald clearly explained the detrimental consequences to El Paso of racial disorders. According to the newspaper, the selfish interests of both El Paso and Juarez required peace. Those interests for the American city involved the economic importance of the Mexican working class. The city's development as a major commercial center between the United States and Mexico also demanded peaceful conditions. Many El Pasoans, especially those who have come here in recent years, the Herald informed its audience, do not seem to realize that this city's prosperity, growth, economic power, financial and commercial prestige, and social welfare depend most largely on our retaining reasonable, just, and friendly relations with the Spanish-speaking population within our own borders and with the neighbors of the Southern Republic," unquote. Acknowledging the pre-American presence of Mexicans in El Paso and their cultural influence along the border, the Herald pointed out an obvious fact. The Spanish-speaking people are as much a permanent fixture here and hereabouts as the mountains, unquote. Perhaps the Herald's strongest argument for racial harmony concerned the future economic contributions of a vast local Mexican population to the growth and prosperity of El Paso. Quote, "The Herald firmly believes," unquote, "the newspaper concluded that these people have potentially tremendous value to these communities, which has never been clearly understood, has never been developed, has never been directed or trained, has never been used, has never been acknowledged, has never been conserved, and we have not made more useful and contented and progressive citizens out of this element is chiefly our own fault, not theirs," unquote. Pershing's withdrawal ended El Paso's intense experience with revolutionary politics. Although still faced with scattered rebellion, Carranza's faction dominated the Mexican political scene and institutionalized its victory through the Constitution of 1917. With its promises of representative government, land redistribution, labor reforms, and the nationalization of the Mexican economy, for several years, the scene of political intrigues, revolutionary plotting, and gun running, El Paso and its involvement with the revolution had been reduced by 1917 to efforts by political refugees to peacefully return to their homeland. The revolution had affected every sector of the El Paso community, but its large impact fell on the local Mexican population. Mexican Americans, faced with a major test of their loyalties, had been placed on the defensive and had reacted by strongly pledging their allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, unquote. The immigrants and refugees, on the other hand, bore the brunt of the revolution's dislocating impact, as well as the racial animosity generated along the border by the Civil War. One historian has correctly labeled the increased anti-Mexican sentiment in the United States during this period as the Brown Scare. Despite the dangers, many Mexicans not only concerned themselves with the events in La Patria, but supported in their own small ways the different revolutionary juntas operating out of El Paso. The Mexican Revolution not only exposed El Paso's unavoidable ties with Mexico, but had clearly revealed the nationalist conscientious of the Mexican immigrant population. To the immigrant generation of 1910, politics meant the revolution, and one's country meant Mexico. This is the end of Chapter 9, Part 2. Thank you.